Welcome to the Blended Finance Project interview series, where we talk to international development and solidarity scholars, labor and civil society activists about the recent turn to so-called innovative finance for development in Canada. I'm your host, Susan Spronk, Associate Professor at the School of International Development and Global Studies at the University of Ottawa.
All right, hi everyone, welcome back. Today we're here with Daniel Bertossa. Daniel is an Assistant General Secretary at Public Services International. He manages policy, advocacy, and governance. He also leads the Public Services International economic policy work in trade, tax, debt, and the future of quality public services. Thanks very much for joining us, Daniel.
Thanks, Suzanne. Great to be here.
Great. So my first question is actually about Public Services International. So what is Public Services International, and why are you interested in questions of financing for development and specifically tax justice, which is something you've been working a lot on?
Thanks, Susan. Public Services International is a global union federation. So we represent public sector workers across the world in about 170 countries and about 650 unions. And we're interested in issues of development and also interested in issues of public services. Firstly, because our members are the people who work in these public services and have a very good understanding of what they do and how they work best. But also because as a trade union, we're interested in workers and ensuring that workers get their cut from the benefits and the wealth that's produced in society. And public services are a really important way of both ensuring that the most needy in our societies and communities get what they need to live happy and healthy and prosperous lives, but also to redistribute wealth to those who need it, and to ensure that those who have the means to pay actually do pay. And that's the tax policy interest that we have, both to fund public services so everybody can enjoy them, but also to redistribute wealth.
Great, thanks. So this project is about blended finance. And one of the reasons we're concerned about blended finance is part of the agenda entails the use of public money, such as foreign aid, which of course is funded by tax dollars at the end of the day, to leverage sources of private finance for development. So why do you think that this approach to financing is misguided?
Well, firstly, I think we need to have a very clear idea in our own heads about how development occurs. And when you look at the way in which the developed countries developed their economies and their social systems, it's not at all the way that they prescribe for developing countries now. And so, and a lot of myths have been created around this that just don't stack up when you look at the history and the evidence. And so the first one is that high taxes are somehow bad for development. But in fact, if you look at the correlation between taxation and development, high taxation is actually highly correlated with high levels of development. It's also about the things that are needed to develop a country. And again, when you look back 100, 150 years ago, when some of the rich countries were industrializing, they did have high taxes, particularly on people who were earning a lot of money. And they were using those taxes to provide the things that the economy needed to industrialize. So things like infrastructure, roads and ports, electricity and water, but also education. They understood that in order to have a developed economy and a healthy society, you needed to have broad-based education. And this all took public money. Another thing that happened with that development path is that there needed to be stable institutions. Developing countries do want investment, and investment is attracted by all these things: a healthy workforce, a well-educated workforce, good ports and infrastructure, reliable energy. But they also are looking for a stable political and economic environment, and having good courts, professional police, a legal system, a bureaucracy that introduces good public policy, deals with crises and emergencies. This all requires public funding. And so these are the reasons why development and public spending and a strong public sector are actually very closely connected. And there's another point that is quite important before we look at the specifics of blended finance, and that is that a lot of the industrialization that occurred in the richest countries in the world occurred under protectionist regimes. Throwing open your doors to foreign investment, throwing open your doors to foreign multinationals to come in and provide things, actually crowds out and kills local economic development. And so the US, Europe, Australia, Great Britain, all industrialized under a system of fairly protectionist industrial policy. And yet when we give aid, or when we try to help, supposedly help developing countries to develop, in fact, we tell them to do exactly the opposite to what we did when we were industrializing and getting wealthy. And I use tax as an example because there were very, very high levels of tax around when these countries were developing. And the other thing that we need to be careful about is this idea that there's technology transfer, this idea that if you just throw open the doors to foreign investment and foreign capital, they'll come in, they'll create jobs, and the technology will transfer. And that's rarely the case. We rarely see that. And why would they? They want to keep their technology, they want to keep their secrets, because that's how they make money. And COVID at the moment is demonstrating that in a really tragic way, because despite there being billions of taxpayer and government funding going into vaccine development, the companies that have then commercialized that and are now rolling that out don't want to give away their intellectual property. Even though if they did, we could vaccinate most of the world much, much quicker. They just simply don't want to give it away because that will undermine their profits. And so I think for all of these reasons, we need to think carefully about the type of development model that we're promoting. Specifically, blended finance is a problem. Firstly, because it's based on an idea that there just isn't enough money to fund public goods. And that's just not true. There's actually a lot of money out there to fund these public goods. And PSI and the Tax Justice Network have released research recently that shows that there's at the very least 427 billion annually that's being taken out of the public coffers through corporate tax avoidance. And this is not including all sources. The figure's probably much higher. Just to put this in perspective, because we do live in the era of COVID, that's the equivalent of 34 million nurses' salaries annually. It's more than enough to bring the entire world out of extreme poverty. And yet that's the amount of money that our governments are allowing to escape the tax office because of these rules. And in a place like Africa, the amount of money that's lost to illicit financial flows is larger than the entire amount of aid that Africa receives. And so if we just made corporations pay the taxes that they should, you could double the amount of aid flowing into Africa. But even more importantly than this, it would be a really important move in terms of self-determination, because the African governments could collect their own revenue and decide what they wanted to do, what was in their own best interest with that money. And it wouldn't come with a lot of the conditions that are attached to foreign aid. Look, secondly, one of the big problems with blended finance is that it invites markets into areas where all the evidence shows that markets just can't deliver. And public services are a good example. You only have to look at the health system in the USA to understand that the last thing you want to be doing is inviting corporations to privatize your health system. Energy, where renewables need government support, but in fact it's the private sector that's backing in behind coal, and water, where we know, for example, that privatization has driven up prices to users. Thirdly, blended finance generally isn't being asked from developing countries. I mean, this is an agenda that's driven largely by rich Western countries, largely by their foreign affairs departments, who increasingly trade and development are being linked together. And it's being driven very heavily by large corporations. And that's happening now for some very specific reasons. And one of them is that we have very low interest rates. And so returns from money saved is low. We're having very low growth and profit rates in many developed markets. And so a lot of these investments bring 10 to 15% returns, and they're very attractive, and they're guaranteed returns because they're government contracts. So the private sector is really behind this push to have blended finance because it's very, very profitable for them. And then lastly, the main reason why we're skeptical about blended finance is that it often just doesn't work. I mean, these are very complex financial arrangements that are very hard to administer and very inflexible. And more often than not, they're much more expensive than just providing money to government to do government business. And there's lots of examples, but one that I like is the way Germany has made a mess of so many of its PPPs and other mixed financial instruments. The airport in Berlin, the PPP was abandoned because it was over 5 years late and it was massively over cost. And there's a concert hall in Hamburg that was contracted for 114 million. And in the end, it was delivered at 780 million, 7 times the original price. And if the public sector had just done it themselves, they would have got it done quicker and cheaper. And so if countries like Germany can't, if their governments can't manage to control the market forces and the private contracts, then the idea that that some of these developing countries are going to be able to negotiate equally with some of the largest corporations on the planet, I think is just really, really misplaced.
Great, thank you. So one of the things that you said refers to one of the sectors that we know that blending has supposedly been the most successful, because based on evidence from Europe, where European development organizations or development finance institutions have been funding projects overseas, we know that it goes to mostly middle-income countries, and we know that it goes to sectors such as finance and energy. Now, trade unions in Canada and globally have worked a lot on what is called the just transition, or looking at non-carbon forms of economy. So I'm wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about the energy sector in particular, and why you think that it's not going to work and why that's not a bankable sector. What do you mean when you say that that is blended finance is going to be limiting in terms of delivering public services for all?
So there is a lot of rhetoric around being bankable, and in some ways it is very, very bankable. The private companies that are invited in to provide some of these services are extremely profitable, and they are very, very happy to be involved in the provision of these services with guaranteed revenue streams from developing countries. So in one sense, it is bankable to the private companies that are being brought in. The real question, though, is whether or not it's serving the social and economic objectives that we want for our aid money. And there, I think it's a slightly different question. Firstly, the market tends to want profitable options, and the public sector exists precisely because markets fail. There are certain things markets won't do. They won't provide essential services to people who can't pay for them. And they won't provide services to places where they're not profitable. And so that's why we see with these blended finance initiatives that they tend to be in areas where there is a profitable sector and where there is middle income opportunities, precisely because the market will go where there are profits to be made. The problem, of course, is that where there are profits to be made, that they are often the most privileged sections of the market. They're the sections of the market that can afford to pay. There's a second question, though, around, for example, energy, and that is, what do we want from our energy policy? And if the answer is simply to produce as much cheap energy as possible for those who can pay, then the market does do a reasonable job at that. But we know now that there are massive externalities from energy policy, and that if we don't deal with the climate crisis, that there will be much bigger aid and development problems all over the world. And the people that have created the climate crisis are the large private sector polluters. It's the market that burns coal. It's the market that, despite the evidence for the last 20 years, hasn't been making the transition. And if we're going to make the transition to a green economy, and we're going to head off the worst effects of the climate crisis, then we need radical change, and we need it quickly, because the market is not doing it quickly enough at the moment. And that's going to require large amounts of public intervention. It's going to require public energy to shift the way in which we generate electricity and energy, and it's going to require heavy regulation. And all of this is opposed by the private sector. And so, if at the same time as we're demanding radical change in energy markets, we're also cementing the role of the private sector, often with long-term contracts that can't be changed for 10 or 20 years, which then stop governments from evolving and innovating and changing the way their energy policy, then this just locks in the current model that is not good for the climate, and it's not good for people either. Because what we find is that the private sector will cherry pick, and they will take the most lucrative markets, and they will lock in long-term contracts. But when circumstances change, they won't adapt. They will demand more money from these to renegotiate these contracts, and they'll demand higher prices. And there's a lot of evidence in the developing world and the developed world that shows that these providers don't provide water and energy to those who most need it. They do drive up costs, and they are very inflexible when circumstances change, and they will change drastically in coming decades because of the need to deal with climate crises. If you're locked into a long-term contract under those circumstances, they're very inflexible.
Certainly, we've seen that problem in the water sector in the past, where private corporations have sued governments in the context of financial crisis underneath the World Bank International Court for the Settlement of Investment Disputes. Yeah, so thank you for bringing that into the conversation. So what you've said so far really speaks, I think, to alternatives around blended finance. You've talked about tax justice. You've talked about closing tax havens in particular, but also redistributional policies. So what else do you think governments should be doing, but specifically aid agencies, with respect to this global agenda?
So firstly, aid agencies can provide technical assistance. A country like Canada has a well-developed public sector and has a lot of expertise around running a good public service and providing good public services. And you can provide that support to other countries, and that's very, very valuable. There is also a certain amount of support that is required in regards to tax policy. So assisting developing countries develop their own tax policies that are progressive, because all too often the international financial institutions, but also domestic governments, find that it's politically easiest just to increase value-added taxes or consumption taxes, which are very regressive, and particularly regressive in developing countries. And so developing good progressive tax policy is important. Assisting those countries to collect tax from corporations is very, very important. And it's particularly important because the easiest way for corporations to dodge tax is if they're multinationals. It's very hard for domestic firms to dodge tax in the way that multinationals do. And so ensuring that governments are able to enforce good tax policy on foreign corporations actually raises revenue, but it also evens the playing field for their local corporations, and it means they're not at a competitive disadvantage, and that's very good for local development policy. And part of the reason why that doesn't happen is because there's this myth that if you want to increase foreign investment, you need to lower your tax policies. And if you look at a place like the USA, straight after the Second World War, they had 90% tax rates on the highest levels of income, and well above 60% on corporate taxation. And that was the era where they had the most economic growth. And there's just not a lot of evidence that shows that high tax rates stop growth and stop investment. There are other things as well, though. One is debt. And debt, again, is another one of these areas where there have been lots of myths. Um, Private finance is often provided on the basis that it keeps debt down, that we don't want countries to get into too much debt. The problem, of course, with a lot of these concessions is that they are a decade-long contracts that oblige somebody to pay payments through that contract each year. And so whether or not you've borrowed and you're paying back debt, or whether or not you're paying a concession to a private provider for the investment they've made, the effect on the budget bottom line is exactly the same. You are locked into long-term payments that you can't use to spend on your own domestic services and economic development. But at the moment, governments can borrow far more cheaply than corporations. So actually, governments directly borrowing themselves at the moment is a better way to finance a lot of this productive infrastructure. And on top of that, you don't have to pay a private sector company to do something for them to borrow at a higher rate. But you're also, they will also be more expensive because they need to pay dividends and they have very high executive salaries. And so there's just a lot of extra payments that come with a blended finance initiative. And if the government just borrowed the money itself at lower rates, it could actually borrow more cheaply. And then I think the last area is industry policies. I've mentioned that in the global north, the industrialization occurred with a lot of government intervention to develop infant industries. And if you look at the incredible economic growth in a country like China, probably the fastest industrialization the world's ever seen, and certainly the country that has lifted the most people out of severe poverty the fastest in the history of the world, all of that economic development was done with industry policy, by governments creating the conditions for domestic industries to grow. And I think this is the sort of policies that we should be encouraging the developing world to take up, because there's this view that export-led growth is the only path to development. But logically, not all countries can be exporters. Everybody can't be net exporters. And so what is often the case is that it's much more important for these countries' path to development, certainly in the initial stages of industrialization, is to produce goods for their own domestic markets or trade with their neighbors. And that is a far more sustainable path to economic and ultimately social development than throwing open the doors to foreign investment and then having those foreign investors come in and crowd out your local development. But it also has important social impacts as well, because these are all prescriptions around, essentially around lowering the barriers for foreign multinationals to come into your country and make profit. And what comes with that is the recommendations and the drive to lower wages. And so workers suffer, they don't have as much money, and therefore they don't spend as much money in the economy, which undermines economic growth. But it also undermines social progress because you don't have the workers who are creating the wealth benefiting from the wealth they create through wages. It often comes with a lot of pressure to deunionize, to have export zones where you don't allow organization. It often comes with a lot of pressure to ignore environmental degradation. And so the model that's being promoted through blended finance is part of a broader agenda to drive down wages, drive down people's rights to organize, drive up inequality, and ignore environmental degradation, when the alternative is a high wage, a sustainable path that takes government investment and invests in things that will add value to the economy, things like educating the workforce and productive infrastructure.
Yeah, reinforcing what you said, there was a recent OECD report, I believe, which was lamenting the fact and wondering why trade unions were not part of the blended finance agenda, and sort of calling attention to this fact. Anyway, so COVID-19 has exposed many of the inequalities in our societies and, in fact, perhaps made them worse, particularly amongst workers, formal, informal, racialized workers, long gender lines, people with disabilities as well. So I'm wondering if you can spend a minute or two describing some of these inequalities and talk about the role of the public sector in finding solutions to this health and economic crisis that we're facing.
I think one of the main things that COVID-19 has done, and particularly the periods of confinement, is to expose the enormous amount of hidden work that keeps our economies running. A lot of that work is unpaid work, so domestic work in the home, but a lot of it is undervalued work, work that keeps our society running and has enormous value, because if it wasn't done, our societies and our communities wouldn't function. But because it's hidden, people don't really see it and they take it for granted. And the obvious example, I think, is long-term care, where we take for granted that some very low-paid workers who are often exploited are actually looking after some of the most vulnerable people in our societies. And if we get that wrong, the consequences are pretty severe. And the workers in this sector are often women, often migrants, and it's the association with that work as being unpaid women's work in the home that contributes to it being undervalued. It's also the association with it being migrant work and the undervaluing of migrants in our community that allows it to go on for so long and not be recognised. But what we've seen is that these sectors are also highly financialised, and where they are financialised, we've had much worse outcomes in terms of death rates in long-term care in Canada, but also in other countries around the world. And this is for a range of reasons. And one of them is when you undervalue work, it's much easier to exploit it. It's much easier to justify making it insecure. It's much easier to pay lower wages. And because a lot of the workers, for example, in long-term care have had multiple jobs, they've had to go from workplace to workplace, and that's spread COVID. They've also been the workers that have been, because of the precarious nature of their work, have often been unable to say no to coming into work. And so we've seen a lot of cases where people who are sick and they've gone to work, not because they wanted to go to work sick, not because they were somehow negligent, but quite simply they're worried that if they don't take this shift, that the boss might not give them another shift. And that precarity of that set of workers has really been exposed in the way in which the virus has spread from sick workers who also have been doing multiple jobs. Look, I think it's also shone a very, very bright light on the amount of unpaid domestic work that is done almost exclusively by women in households. And it's the similar sort of work. So it's unpaid childcare, it's household work, which again is often, when it is outsourced to migrant communities very cheaply and often informally. And also care work in families, looking after older people or just checking on people, going around to make sure Nana's okay, or providing small supports to people in our community who are more vulnerable, disabled people or people with underlying health conditions who rely on community supports. And a lot of this work falls on women, and as I said, when it is done through the informal workforce, through migrant communities. But at the same time, COVID has also shone a light on the answers. And that is that where this work is done well, it's often done through public provision of social care work. So I think a lot of people were quite shocked at what it was like to have their kids home from school. And I think they had a very new appreciation of what teachers and education support workers and after-school care workers actually do for them in terms of looking after their kids. I think it's also been quite shocking for people who've had to make very difficult choices about looking after aged relatives or disabled friends or family, and also a lot of people who've had to do their own cleaning and other associated care work. And so I think it's driven a renewed understanding that the answer to most of these problems is to value social care work. And to understand that it is a social exercise. It's not an economic activity. If we treat it like an economic activity, then we're exploiting the people who do it, and we're leaving ourselves vulnerable, as COVID has shown. And because it is a social activity, we should have a collective responsibility. We should provide these things as much as possible through the public system. We need public health care. We need public disability care. We need public long-term care. We need to be providing good public schools and good after-school care so that everybody, men and women, can enjoy access to work and the independence that brings with it. And that is both socially good, but also economically good, as we've seen with our response to COVID. Actually, I'll say something else as well, just quickly on that. I think COVID's also shown that if we're going to revalue the care work, the social care work that's being done in our communities, in our societies, part of that is ensuring that those workers aren't exploited. To value that work and to have it provided properly through the public sector, we need to make sure that these are well-trained jobs, that we provide the public recognition for these staff, but also ensure that they're not in precarity, that they are decent jobs and permanent jobs, well-paid jobs, that mean that these workers can focus on providing the care to the community that we need, and not just trying to get through the day and scrape out a living.
So my last question, Daniel, is if you see any momentum in favor of public financing of essential services. We've talked a lot about health. We could talk about education, water and sanitation, energy, transportation is another one we could talk about in the context of the current crisis. And what do we need to turn the tide in favor of public financing of these services?
I think there has been a big appreciation of the sacrifice of public sector workers over the course of the COVID pandemic. And in many countries, you've seen people clapping from balconies, and that's really critical. And often they get called heroes, but we say these people aren't heroes. These people are just doing their job. And if you really want to support public sector workers to make sure that we're all safe, then we shouldn't just clap, and we certainly shouldn't call them heroes. What we should be doing is supporting them in their work into the future. And I think there's a lot of support for that. I think people are realizing that when the pandemic hit, a lot of the myths we've been told about the private sector, that it's flexible and innovative and it will help us when we need, and that government is bureaucratic, that they realized that just wasn't the case, that the personal protective equipment that they were meant to be providing wasn't being provided, that a lot of the privatized long-term care facilities weren't keeping old people and vulnerable people safe, and the government had to step in to make sure they were. That things like transport and waste collection were being provided by public workers, and that when everybody else was trying to keep themselves safe, it was public sector workers who were actually keeping the community running. And so I think there's a much bigger appreciation. I also think there's a bigger appreciation of the need to provide finance through taxation to fund these services. I think everybody's seen the massive profits that Big Pharma's making, and the way in which they aren't actually providing the vaccines fast enough, even though they've received enormous government subsidies. I think everybody's seen the way in which the digital economy and big tech has made massive profits out of the COVID pandemic, or during the COVID pandemic, and is still paying almost no tax in most places in the world. And I think people are pretty angry about that and can see that these large corporations need to be paying their fair share. So I think the combination of people appreciating public services and also getting angry about tax dodging has the potential to create change. But it's not enough in and of itself. And we've seen this with the global financial crisis. There was a great surge of hope after the global financial crisis that we would do things differently, that finance would be made to pay, that somehow we would definancialize our economy. And the risk is that when things go back to normal, or to some semblance of normal, that people stop being angry and allow these things to continue. So it's really up to trade unions like PSI, but also all of our partners in countries around the world, to keep on reminding people of the sacrifices that were made by these workers, to keep on reminding people of the way in which these large corporations still not paying their taxes, and that when they don't, working people pay more. We pay more through value-added taxes, VAT, and we often pay more through income tax that's too high. We don't get the opportunity to route our income tax through Luxembourg or Switzerland or the Caribbean, but a lot of these corporations do. And I think every time we talk about that, every time we make these cases and we talk about these stories and we show the injustice of it, workers get really angry. So one of the most important things we can do is just on telling those stories and keep on reminding people who kept them safe. And in a place like Canada, part of that is about transparency. I think a lot of people don't realize that Canada is one of the most opaque of the developed countries in the world in terms of tax transparency. It's actually very hard. It's easier in the UK and in Europe and even in the US in some places to get good information about what corporations are doing than it is in Canada. And in Canada, there is a lot that can be done just introducing corporate transparency, because when you see what these companies are doing and you understand the amount of money they're making and how little tax they're paying, most people are pretty outraged, and the conclusions are pretty simple. And the real problem is it's legal, and our politicians don't necessarily want us to know what's going on, because if we were angry about it, we would demand they do something, and that's a bit hard for them. And some of them are actually bought in to that system. So we need to keep on telling the stories. We need to keep on reminding people of how it could be better, and keep on reminding people of why it's in their interests to have less of the tax burden fall on workers, but also that we all need quality public services. And if the rich aren't paying for it, then we won't get the services that we deserve.
Yeah, what you're saying reminds me of a number of years ago, the Panama Papers exposed Canadian corporations, in particular mining corporations, which are huge overseas. And that's been a big concern of the international development and solidarity community. And we've done a lot of good work in terms of trying to push for transparency that continues. But thank you for that reminder that there's a lot of work to do in Canada. So thank you so much, Daniel. That was really useful in terms of putting a lot of the different pieces of this puzzle together and emphasizing why public services have to be at the corners, or the bedrock of a recovery, of a just recovery and a better world. We have an opportunity before us, and public sector workers have to be part of that agenda at the front of it. So thank you so much for.
Thanks a lot, Susan. It's great being with you.